president gets his wish and replaces Jay Powell, not just who is he going to, not the name of who's he going to put in that seat, but what can that new Fed chair do to get us out of this vortex that we're in?
Well, unless he makes a Faustian bargain with the president to lower interest rates and potentially soften the blow from any impending recession, or he could exacerbate inflationary pressures that come from the tariffs that are currently in place. We don't know. It's hard to say what any Fed chair could do. By the way, he's not the only voter on the policy setting committee of the Federal Reserve. There are many others who voice their opinions and offer their votes, one of whom could be Jerome Powell, whose position as chair may expire in 2026, but he remains a governor until 2028. He could stay on for another 2 years on the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve. So he would still have a say, small say to be exact, 1/12 of the decision-making process. But I don't know what a Fed chair would do if indeed the president replaced Jay Powell, which is currently illegal. But if he tried, what we do know is there'd be even more market chaos than we have now.
Tyler, can we go back to the trifecta I mentioned? Stocks, bonds, and the dollar all dropping. This clear sign that global investors are saying, we don't feel great about America right now. When do we get to a point where this reality breaks through to this White House? What is happening inside the White House with Trump and his team as they're looking at these numbers every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big focus for the Trump team right now is trying to make trade deals with some of these countries during this 90-day pause. One of the things that I think is important to note is that these trade deals are usually the work of months, if not years, of delicate negotiations. Trade deals, Stephanie, as you know, are very complex and require a lot of hashing out the details. And that is not what Trump is allowing for with this 90-day pause. There's a rush of activity to try to get these deals done. And some experts and analysts say it's likely maybe one or two of them with close allies, maybe Japan and South Korea, could get done in that time frame, but that's unlikely to change the global economic picture. And so I think one of the things that we have to watch for is the Trump administration, the president and his allies have said that Americans may need to deal with some short-term pain for long-term gain, that they are right-sizing the global economic market and ensuring that Americans are getting a fair trade deal with partners. The question is, how long is that bargain? And one of the larger things looming over all of this is this idea that Trump has put forth that they are going to restart a manufacturing boom in the United States. That is not something that can happen overnight. And so if that's the sort of time frame or horizon that we're looking on, Americans are going to be under some pressure when it comes to prices for quite some time.
20 years and about a few $1 trillion. I want to share a bit of what our colleague Steve Leisman said earlier about how the economy is tied to pretty much most of what Trump is doing these days. Watch this.
Let me see if I can connect this to the things that you report on all day long, which is not necessarily the financial markets, but what's going on with the Supreme Court, what's going on with the legal firms, what's going on with Harvard and these others. There are things that the president has done that nobody ever thought a president would do. And that's why in financial markets, you cannot dismiss some probability that the president will fire the Fed chair. People say, oh, it's not going to happen. I said, well, we thought he was going to follow the Supreme Court. We thought he was not going to necessarily withhold X billions of dollars from Harvard. So it's all of the same piece, in that you cannot relax and you cannot bet on a team where the captain is hitting the ball into his own net.
Susan, what is your reaction? I mean, you know this. For the last 8 years, big Trump supporters have said, oh, that's just his bluster. He's not going to do it. But here we have it. He's doing it.
Yeah, I think it's right to connect the dots between the assault on, many different independent institutions, which is a theme that has run through the not quite 100 days of this second Trump term. And I would point out that as far as Chairman Powell goes, you noted that he was appointed by Donald Trump in his first term. Donald Trump also repeatedly threatened to fire Powell in his first term. In fact, we did reporting for our book, The Divider, and it was clear that some senior officials at the Fed literally could not go to sleep for months worrying about the next day being the day that there would be a constitutional crisis, an impasse between the independent Federal Reserve and the White House. It didn't come to pass in part because it was a very different regime at that time, and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, essentially spent almost full time managing Trump to avoid that kind of catastrophe. By the way, Powell was prepared to spend, quote, every last nickel of his own money, and he has millions and millions of dollars, in order to go to court to stop Donald Trump from eroding the independence of the American Central Bank, which many Wall Street investors, of course, believe is one of the pillars of our economy. So if Trump takes the next step, I would expect Powell to consider very seriously suing him. I would expect there to be a major crisis that obviously will add further instability into our markets and a level of uncertainty at the core of the American financial system that I think is unlike anything we've ever seen. If there is that kind of outright confrontation between the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the president of the United States.
David, almost everything Susan just laid out, I've heard from Wall Street investors and bankers over the last 5 days. The last thing they want to see is Jay Powell fired, even if they're not big supporters of him, and the Fed losing their independence. Very few of them are speaking publicly, despite their panic. What does that tell you about the fear they have or the concern they have about speaking publicly? Because none of these people, none of these big investors are shy when it comes to press time.
Yeah, well, that's because they've paid attention the last decade or so, and they've seen how Donald Trump lashes out at critics. They have businesses to run, they have investment funds to manage, and they cannot afford to be on the receiving end of a president who is willing to stretch the bounds of executive power. And look, people might be surprised based on what they thought they would get from Trump, but based on what they got from Trump the first term. But they shouldn't be. Trump always enjoys chaos. He is comfortable in it, especially when he's at the center of it and all of the chaos revolves around him. And so I think you can expect, particularly because tariffs are the one thing that he is an ideologue on, that he will keep pushing this and try and get other aspects of government to sort of open a relief valve, if you will, to make the impact of the tariffs and his indecision easier for the economy to stomach. I think the question is whether or not the Treasury Secretary Besant and Lutnick on occasion can get through to him to have him sort of soften the edges of what he's doing. They were able to do it somewhat with the 90-day pause. The 90 days is going to run out. What is going to happen then?
Ron, you wrote today about what it would do to America's global reputation if the president replaces the Fed chair. I want you to lay it out for us.
Well, it's like any other kind of chaotic event, except orders of magnitude larger. Because if you take an independent...
Pure chaos, but way worse.
But way worse, yeah. I mean, no, from what we've experienced now, tariffs, you can argue, all day long about whether they're worthwhile or not, even though they're slowing the economy and affecting consumers or will affect consumers sometime soon. An independent Federal Reserve, or broadly speaking, an independent central bank is the gold standard of modern economics. And if you were to remove by force, for political reasons alone, the independence and threaten the independence of the Federal Reserve, and have ultimately the president, to a certain extent, being the decider in chief on interest rate policy, you've now moved the Fed from being an independent economic regulator, if you will, to one that's politically motivated. And that would be disastrous. And you'd see most likely a run on the dollar, large sales of Treasury bonds, so interest rates would go up and the stock market would go down. Everyone who talks about this and everyone who discusses it, including Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee, says just look at the countries that do not have independent central banks and see how their currencies perform, see how their economies perform. He would pay a large price for making a move like that.